thanks for coming back. I'm going to share screen and we'll talk. There we go. Let me put it on full screen view for you. The less of me, more of the PowerPoint, it's better. Okay, so as Nicole said earlier, and as I admitted, Harry Truman's always been my hero. I love Truman. I have a lot of heroes in history, but he's probably my favorite. And one of the, and I probably have 10 different Truman speeches I give, but one of the things that strikes me about him is he was such a common guy, such an ordinary guy who did uncommon and extraordinary things. And I had a wonderful opportunity for about a 7-year period, starting about almost 25 years ago. I tracked down every former living advisor, secretary, speechwriter, general, everybody that worked for Truman. And over a multiple year period, I conducted intensive interviews with all of them, taped these and sent them to the Truman Library, and then also hosted a series of annual conferences on Harry Truman with all these, the director of the Truman Library, Truman's grandkids, all the aides that worked for him. So I've been able to collect some wonderful stories over the years. I'm also on the Truman Foundation board, so I go to the Truman home, the Truman Little White House, and the Truman Library every year to do work. So I thought I'd just start off by sharing with you a couple of fun stories, and then we'll jump into, that'll show you what a common guy he was, but yet an uncommon leader he was. So one of my first stories I taped, I found one of Truman's secretaries, and I may have told some of you this before. Her name was Wanda, and I was going to tape record her, videotape her. So I told her, just tell me a story about Harry as a way of just getting the juices flowing and having her calm down so she wouldn't be nervous about being filmed. And she told me that she and a couple secretaries sat off in a corner and they did all the phones and the typing. And she was in her early 20s. So it wasn't like she was Truman's main secretary. So she said one day she brought in a photograph of her son. And I don't remember the son's age. Let's name and age. Let's say it was Joe and he was 5. I don't know. And she said, Truman comes walking by and there's a whole office complex of workers. And she said that he yells across the place. He says, Wanda, is that a new photograph on your desk? And she says, yes. And she said, I couldn't believe he knew my name, and he's paying attention to me. He's the president. And, this is right after World War II. And he says, well, who is it? And she said, it's my son. He goes, well, what's his name? She said, Joe. And he goes, well, how old's Joe? She said, he's 5. Well, he's not 5. He'll be 5 in another 9 weeks on December 16th or whatever. And Truman said, well, tell him Harry said hi. And then he walked in his office. And she's sitting there thinking, did that just happen? How did the president even know me? I'm some young 20-something secretary off on the side. Well, you know where I'm going with this, of course. 9 weeks later, she said, Truman comes walking by again and yells out, Wanda, today's Joe's birthday. Tell him Harry said happy 5th. So what you can see from that is a couple of things. Number one, Truman cared about everybody that worked for him. Number two, he was a man with an extraordinarily big heart, a kind, good guy. And number three, he had a photographic memory. Speaking of the photographic memory, so Truman always wanted to be a military officer. He wanted to go to West Point, but he was an uneducated, the last president to lack a college degree, by the way. He was an uneducated, failed farmer from rural Missouri. He wasn't getting to West Point. He ultimately gets a shot at being a military officer when World War I breaks out. So Truman's concern is this: he's a little older than all the other soldiers enlisting, but he can't see. He has terrible eyesight. He wore glasses from the time he was a child. And when he goes into World War I, he writes that he'd put extra glasses in his rucksack and every pocket, everywhere, in case if he lost or something happened to his glasses because he couldn't see. So he has to take the eye test. He's worried because he knows he won't be able to see the eye chart. So what he does is he lets 2 men go in front of him. And typical Truman, with the photographic memory, he just listens to them read the eye chart. He walked in and said, I could barely see the wall. And he just from memory did the entire eye chart. And the doctor said, you passed. So he memorized the eye chart. There was a fun letter I read in the library that was referred to me by several of these folks that I had interviewed. There was a man, Truman lived at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. And now he's the retired former president. So this man's car breaks down the street from Truman's house. So the man knocks on Truman's door and asks if he could use his telephone to call a tow truck. My students on campus can't believe they didn't have cell phones back in the late 50s. They've never heard of a party line either. And none of them have ever put money in a phone, nor has any one of them ever dialed a phone. So the man asked Truman to borrow his phone. Truman says, yeah. The guy has no idea who Truman is, by the way. He makes the call, calls the tow truck. Truman says, listen, it'll be a few minutes. Why don't you have a seat? And he gets the guy an iced tea. So they're sitting there having an iced tea, just shooting the breeze. Finally, the man says, well, you've been more than kind, and I should get going because the tow truck will be here. So the guy leaves, and Truman walks out in the front porch and walks him out to the sidewalk and is waving. And as the man's leaving, he turns and looks at Truman and says, quote unquote, you know, has anyone ever told you, you look an awful lot like that son of a bitch, Harry Truman? And Truman says, yeah, I get that all the time. Bye-bye. Sometime later, the man realized, oh my goodness, it was Truman. So he wrote a letter to the library apologizing profusely because he didn't know it was actually Harry. Truman kept everything. He wrote everything down. He was kind of a pack rat, which is great for people like me because we probably know more about him than any other president. He wrote everything down. Plus, unlike a lot of politicians, Truman was ridiculously honest, a lot like Lincoln, a lot like Grant, couldn't fib. So he even told us the mistakes he made. So he wrote everything down. Plus, he loved his wife, Bess. Why? I have no idea. Can't stand Bess. He was crazy about Bess to the day, and they both lived long lives. Harry into his 80s, Bess into her 90s. To the day of his death, he told Bess, you're the only gal for me. You know, you're more beautiful now than when we met. So, gentlemen, if there's any guys out there in the Zoomosphere taking notes, pay attention. So Truman always said that, you know, how beautiful she was and how much he loved her. So late in life, Harry walks into their living room and Bess is sitting in front of the fireplace. And she's got a shoebox with his love letters from World War I. So he doesn't interrupt her. He sneaks back around the corner and he's peeking around, watching this endearing moment as his wife reads his love letters from so many decades ago. Then, to his horror, she throws them in the fireplace and he jumps out and yells, Bess, by God, think of history. And she looks at him and she says, I am. So you can imagine how hot and steamy those letters must have been from a young soldier over in France writing back to Bess. The candy bomber. Here's a cute story. You've all, I'll talk about it later, but you've all probably heard of the Berlin airlift in the late 40s. The Soviet Union, when we carve up East Germany and West Germany, East Berlin, West Berlin, the Soviets gobble up a lot of that German territory. And finally, they're going to try for a political move here and seize all of Berlin. So they blockade no road traffic into Berlin, no rail, and no water access. They're going to starve out the entire population, kill the entire city if necessary, and seize Berlin. So Truman's generals say, you know, we got to gas up the tanks and bust that blockade. Truman says that's not acceptable. It's World War III. The State Department says we just got to give it up. We lost. The Soviets got Berlin. Truman says we can't let all these people fall into the Soviet sphere. We got to do something else. So he comes up with a compromise, the 50-yard line. And that's the Berlin airlift. For about a year, we flew airplanes in every couple, minutes with coffee and heating oil and coal and toilet paper and shoes and everything that people needed. So we saved the people of Berlin while the Soviets were willing to kill them. In the middle of the Berlin airlift, which is one of the closest moments the world has ever come to World War III, Truman has a concern. What about the kids in Berlin? You know, we're sending in heating, fuel, and jackets and socks and medicine and bandages and toothpaste, but there's nothing for the kids. So they get a pilot named Gail Horvison, He was known as the candy bomber. And Truman gets the Hershey Foods Company donates tons of free chocolate bars, and he would fly in and waggle his wings, and children would all run, and he would bomb them with chocolate bars. So, in the middle of all this, what president is worried about? Well, the kids don't have anything fun. So Truman assigned the candy bomber. Let me give you one more. There was a young couple on their honeymoon, and they were driving across country, kind of a cross-country Route 66 kind of a tour. I did that by myself on a Harley Davidson many, many years ago. Did a cross-country drive when I was a lone wolf on my Harley. I did. The couple stopped at Truman's house. So they walk up to Truman's house. Today, with the former president, you couldn't do this. There would be Secret Service, gates, motion detectors, guard dogs. They walked up on Truman's porch, and the wife hands the husband a camera. They're going to take a picture pretending that they're walking into Truman's house. That would be a funny picture, right? But as the wife grabs the doorknob and the husband's ready to take it, then they're going to run like hell. To her horror, the front door opened up, and there stands the former president of the United States, Harry Truman. The wife says, "Oh my gosh, I thought I was going to go to jail." And instead, Truman looks at her and says, "Here, hand me the camera." And he told him to go in the house and walk out front, and he's taking pictures. "Now sit on my swing in my porch," and he's taking pictures. "Now walk down, now hold hands," and he's taking pictures. And then when they left, they said that Truman walks out to the road when they get in the car, and he's asking them which way they're going. He said, "Well, go 2 miles, take Route 27. It's quicker. There's a good place to eat on the side of the road." They go driving down the road. The president's out there in the street waving goodbye. Typical Harry Truman, so common. They said the problem was that Truman never, ever, ever took pictures. So when they went and got their film developed, he cut their heads off on almost every picture. The photos were lousy, but at least they had a hell of a story. Sound good, everybody? You got a little sense of Harry? Common man, good guy, and an extraordinary leader, one of the greatest in American history, no question. So here's little Harry. Grew up in rural Missouri, born in the 1800s, Lamar. His family was poor on both sides. They were dirt farmers. The Trumans on both sides of the family were descended from Southern slave owners. So the Trumans were unreconstructed Confederates, you might say. What's amazing about that is Truman grows up to be one of the greatest civil rights, women's rights, Jewish rights leaders in American history, maybe, only second to Lincoln, I guess you could say. So he certainly defies his upbringing. So as a young boy, Harry was picked on mercilessly by all the bullies on the farms because he was bookish. He always carried books everywhere, and he played the piano. He was a great pianist. He used to take the train to piano lessons early in the morning after he milked the cows, did the farm work, then take the train, then come back and go to school. So this kid was up at 3 a.m. And when he'd get off the train, all the bullies would beat him, knock him over, and he'd pick up his glasses and books, dust himself off, puff his chest out, hold his head up, and walk to school. Some boys would have become gun shy or have a chip on their shoulder or dysfunctional or bullies. Truman just became steel. He became like a rock as a result of all this. As a boy, he joins the Missouri, he later joins the Missouri National Guard, where he rises to the rank of captain, Battery D of the artillery. And he goes into World War I. However, Truman's family could be so bigoted that he one day comes home in his blue National Guard uniform, and they told him he had to take off his uniform and leave the house. They vowed there would never be a blue uniform in a Truman house again. There was one during Reconstruction after the Civil War. So that's the kind of upbringing he had, yet he became this great human rights leader. So there he is, Captain Harry, during the war, looking about 10. He emerges as a great hero during the war. He's in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. If anybody knows anything about World War I, this is one of the biggest, most pivotal, and bloodiest battles of the war. And Truman emerges as a great hero. Interestingly, he's almost court-martialed. What happens is the army is stuck. It had been raining and raining and raining. The trucks, the horses, the cannons, everything's knee-deep in mud. It's like quicksand. And there's a group of American soldiers that are being surrounded by Germans, and the German artillery is hitting them. So this unit's going to be wiped out, and the army can't move forward. And Truman's artillery pieces being pulled by horses are way back in line. So Truman asked permission to cut out of line. So he and the men unhitched 4 cannons, and he's down there in the mud with them. And they push them across these fields, push them all the way up on a hill to try to go and fire on the Germans to save these men. Now, the problem is artillery units were given specific quadrants for firing. You know, if Susan Schweitzer is the officer in battery A, she would get quadrant A over here. If Linda Polina is the head of battery B, she might get this quadrant. And if Jen is the head of battery C, Jen would get that quadrant over there, right? So you fire within your quadrants, okay? So the problem was Truman saw that he had a certain quadrant, but he was way out of position anyway because he was trying to save the men. He saw that there was German cannons coming up over here. He also saw that the Germans had a spotter, somebody with field glasses calling in on a radio the coordinates to hit him. So Truman fires out of quadrant to hold off the German artillery and to blow up the advanced spotter and spy. He's almost court-martialed because he fired out of position. Truman says, look, if I didn't do this, our men were going to be killed. He's put on a warning. In the next battle, he does the same dang thing again. So they're going to court-martial him, but then word gets up that Truman saved our men. So he turns out to be a hero instead of being court-martialed. So Truman comes back from World War I, and the men of the Missouri Battery D artillery love him. What a hero he is. He kills men in battle. He sees men die. And it's also a turning point in his life. Truman went into the war as a failed farmer, an uneducated, rural bumpkin from Missouri who didn't have much confidence. He comes out of the war knowing he can lead men, knowing that he was not afraid during combat. He comes back realizing the capabilities he has. Now, he courted Bess for years and years and years. Harry met Bess when they were in grade school, and he fell in love with her in first grade. And he told her he never fell out of love with her. So he tried to court her all through school, and she would never agree to go out with him. You see, Harry was the poor farmer, and Bess came from a sort of an upper middle class family in a poor area, which meant she thought she was all that. Bess was also one of the smartest kids. She was popular, and she was a good tennis player. So Bess always turned Harry down. He would carry her books home. He was persistent. Once after they graduated, it was her birthday, and he knew she loved tennis. So he said, do you have plans for your birthday? She didn't. So as a surprise, he built a dirt tennis court at the farm and invited all of her friends to come over, and they would all play tennis for her birthday. She didn't even show up. So finally, before the war, Bess finally agrees to marry Harry. And after courting her for so long, he says, no, I can't have you marry me and then go off to war. What if I die? What if I come back an amputee or wounded or something? If I come back, then we'll get married. So they waited and got married. She had some miscarriages. They did have one daughter, Margaret. They had a wonderful marriage, a very close marriage, a loyal marriage, and a real partnership. Harry struggled through some business failures. That's him on the right. That's actually Harry Truman behind that horse. Truman speculated on oil and never found any oil, lost everything. So he sold the rig and they hit oil. Truman worked on a farm for 10 years, and then it went belly up. On the left, that's Truman and his best friend, Eddie Jacobson. And they ran a haberdashery business. They were World War I buddies who, like many men during a war, said, if we live through this war, we want to go into business together. So they created their haberdashery. The store went out of business, went bankrupt. Eddie couldn't pay his bills, so Harry covered Eddie's bills for him, even though Harry didn't have much money. So he had one failure after another. Truman finally got a job as a clerk in a bank, the only job he really liked until politics. However, his dad, who was running the farm, had health problems, so Truman had to drop out of college, quit the job at the bank, and go work for his father. So Truman really, really knew hard times. He struggled through one thing after another. He got his start in politics for 2 reasons. One, he came back from the war a hero. people knew all about him, and all the young guys that came back from the war talked about Captain Harry. Number two, thanks to the mob. This is the mafia boss. Y'all remember Boss Pendergast? Anybody remember that name? No one's old enough to remember the 40s and 50s and all that. So this is Boss Pendergast, who's the Kansas City mob boss. He's like, a mafioso type of character. Anyways, Boss Pendergast wants a county administrator. Back then, they called it county judge, not with the robe and a gavel, a county administrator. The county judge's job in Missouri was to build roads and public buildings. And Truman liked that. So Boss Pendergast picks Truman to be his stooge to run for county judge. Here's the deal. He wanted to find some dumb farmer that he could manipulate. He assumed Truman was dumb. Truman was a farmer and Truman was a hero, so he could get elected. So the deal was this. For every mile that Truman paved of road, Pendergast wanted a kickback. For every building, he wanted a kickback. You had to use the bricks from his brick company. You had to use his highway construction company, like the mob. Truman gets elected. Truman builds bridges and buildings, roads everywhere. Never gives Pendergast a penny. Pendergast is so angry because it turned out Truman was super honest. Pendergast runs someone else against Truman in the next election to beat him. Truman eventually comes back and gets reelected and goes all the way up to the Senate. Disparagingly, when Truman was in the Senate, other senators, you call someone the senior senator from Missouri or the junior senator from Missouri. They called him the junior senator from Pendergast to make fun of him, even though Truman never gave Pendergast a penny. Pendergast gets put in jail and then dies. And Truman says, I have to go to the funeral. His aides say, you can't go to the funeral of the mob boss. I mean, that would look like someone like the president, like Biden going to the funeral of John Gotti or Tony Soprano or Donald Trump, right? You can't do stuff like that. So Truman says, I've got to go. So Truman goes to Pendergast's funeral. And there's a mob outside hissing and booing and calling questions out. As Truman's walking in, he turns around and looks at everybody and says, quote unquote, love the sinner, hate the sin. And he went in. He told his aides later, he said he was a bad man, but he was a friend in a way. So I owed him that much. So that was Harry Truman. The Truman Committee. This is what makes Truman famous in Congress. Has anybody heard of the Truman Committee? Okay, well here, here we'll tell you all about it. So when he was in the Senate, he created a committee to look at, and there is a picture of it, cost overruns in the Pentagon. During World War II, surprise, military contractors were ripping off the taxpayer and the government. Gold plating, golden parachutes, you've heard all the analogies. They were overcharging the government and ripping off the taxpayer. Truman used to always say that politics is nasty. It's so nasty that you can forgive almost every political sin. But there's one political sin you can never forgive: wartime profiteering. When companies are making money, when our boys are over there fighting and dying, Truman said that's a one-way ticket to hell. Now, these big companies were overcharging us and making money while our boys were dying in the war. So Truman conducts hundreds of hearings, calls hundreds of witnesses. It's estimated that Truman saved the government, get this, $15 billion back in the 40s during the war by reining in all this cost overrun. He was a relentless crusader when it came to doing this. There's a fun story where one of Truman's former aides told me this one. He said one day he was called into Truman's office to meet with the president. And he comes walking down, and when he meets the secretary outside of Harry's office, there's a group of very distinguished looking, very angry men in three-piece suits. And the aide says to the secretary, listen, whatever business the president has with me can wait. These men over here look really important and really angry. So the secretary says, no, the president was clear. He wants you in his office now. So the aide walks in and says, Mr. President, I don't know if you know this, but there's a group of very distinguished, very angry men. Truman says, yeah, I know about it. He says, have a seat. Let me tell you about those men. He says, that's the board of directors of Chase Bank. He said, during the war, Chase Bank was ripping off the government. They were overcharging as a middleman. They were making gobs of money off our taxpayers off the war. So he said, I went to New York City to see the board, to question them and do an investigation. He said, you know, they made me wait an hour outside their office. So he told the aide, I called you in here because those sons of bitches have another hour to wait. He made them wait an hour before he let him in. He told the aide when he finally let him in, he said, you might want to stay around and listen to this. The aide said, the board came in and he said, Truman read them the Riot Act. Don't you ever make money off of our boys in combat. So that was a vintage Harry Truman. Truman was the vice president, as you know, for FDR. Served only 82, 83 days as vice president. FDR had three vice presidents, John Nance Garner, Henry Wallace, and then Harry. So in 1944, FDR needs to pick a new vice president. Why? Henry Wallace was a good man, a friend of the farmer, but Henry was, he was almost an apologist for Joe Stalin. And of course, Truman saw the writing on the wall, as did FDR, as did everybody, that as soon as World War II ended, Stalin was going to be a problem. So the aides knew two things in 1944, FDR's aides. One, we need a new vice president. Two, it's going to be an important pick because FDR may not live through the next term. His health was that bad. So at the Democratic Convention in 1944, they sat down and FDR asked the aides to put a list together of possible VPs. They made a list of about 7 names. They started looking at the list, and maybe FDR liked the first name on the list, but the aides didn't. Maybe the aides liked the second name, but FDR didn't. So they're going down the list. They can't agree on everything. They're arguing, they're fighting. FDR's tired, he's sick, and he's in a foul mood. Plus, the aides are speaking about him almost in past tense. You know, the boss's health is not good, therefore, you know. FDR, of course, has a big ego, as most of these folks do. FDR finally yells at all the aides, now, I'm here in the room, stop talking about me like that. I'm going to live through my next term. He goes, I'm done with this debate. He goes, who's the last name on the list? They said, Truman. FDR said, get him on the phone and offer him the vice presidency. So shame on FDR. He kind of picked Truman willy-nilly, kind of the way McGovern picked Eagleton in 72 and the way McCain picked Palin. So he picked them really willy-nilly. So they call Truman, and one of the aides is on the phone with Truman, and the aide offers him the vice presidency, and Truman says, tell the president, thank you, but no thank you. I don't want it. I'm happy in the Senate. Truman said he heard the aide telling FDR, and he heard FDR explode in the back of the room, profanities. And FDR yelled and said, you tell Truman that if he wants to break up his political party in the middle of the war, that's on his legacy. So Truman sheepishly comes back on the phone and says, I accept. He didn't want it. David McCullough, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, said Bess was so angry, she almost left Harry because she didn't want him to be the vice president. She didn't want to go to that way. Bess hated politics. And you can see from that picture on the right, Bess is not a happy camper. You can also see, I put these two pictures up for a reason. Harry's been my buddy for decades and decades, my entire 31-year career as a professor. And I've looked at, I think, every photo ever taken of him in the Truman Library and spent my life studying him and history and everything else. And I know all of the looks on Truman's face, as you do with friends and family. And can't you all, with a loved one or a kid, if they're worried or something's not right, can't you tell it in their face? I can tell it in Harry's, as I can tell in my own kids. Look at Harry on the right. He is scared to death. He is not happy about this is when FDR died. Harry is thinking, oh my goodness. When FDR died and Truman gets the word, he goes to see Eleanor. And he says, my God, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry. What can I do for you? And that's when Eleanor famously says, "No, Mr. Truman, you're the one in it now. What can I do for you?" So Eleanor's the one that first preps Truman. He never knew about the Manhattan Project. He had heard of it, but had no idea what it was. Eleanor preps Harry on a lot of the things before he gets the full prep from the generals and the aides. Truman walks out from the meeting with Eleanor, which would be right before he's sworn in here. And there's a group of reporters. And Truman says to them, he goes, "I don't know if any of you ever worked on a farm and had a bale of hay fall on you." He says, "I feel like the entire barn has fallen on me." He said, "In fact, I feel like the stars and the heavens have fallen on me." Then he tells the reporters, he said, "If any of you pray for me now. I need it." And the reporter said that Truman looked like he saw a ghost. So, and on the left there, Truman only had 2 meetings with FDR, just 2 during the 82 days that he was vice president. And this is one of the meetings. It was simply a photo opportunity. So they didn't talk or do anything. They just were told to sit there like they were chums, and they took a picture of them having tea, and then that was it. And Truman said, he said, "My God, I knew I was going to be the president at that meeting." Look at FDR there, everybody. He doesn't look healthy, does he? He's not that FDR with the chin up and the cigarette up in the air, right? He's not that, thick-chested, thick-shouldered, confident FDR. He looks terrible here. Truman said, "My God, he looked more dead than alive." And when they were having tea, FDR could not drink the tea. He was shaking so badly while trying to hold it. It was spilling. He couldn't serve himself. And you can look at Truman's face there when they said to smile. That's one of those, "Oh my God" smiles. That's an uncomfortable smile right there. I've not seen that look on Truman in any other photograph that exists on him. So Harry became the vice president and became the president very quickly. But my goodness, did this man ever grow into the office? He became the president during arguably one of the most critical hours in world history. And of course, the world loved FDR. And now who's the president? Newspapers wrote, "Harry who?" Other newspapers wrote, "To err is Truman." Nobody thought Truman would be a good president, but boy, did he do well in the job. His presidency is one of the most momentous and extraordinary in American history. A lot of you have heard me say this. I'm a broken record player. If you look at presidents, all presidents will have 2 or 3 really, really big issues plopped down on their plate or desk. Many presidents go 0 for 2 or 0 for 3. They strike out on those issues. Every once in a while, you have a president like Washington or FDR or Lincoln that gets several big issues on their plate, and they get them right. By my counting, Truman had more big issues than any other president who's ever served, including Lincoln, including FDR, including Biden, can you imagine dealing with what he's dealing with? The whole world's gone batty. Everything's gone wrong. But Truman, whether it was NATO, dropping the bomb, the UN, food aid programs, the Berlin airlift, statehood for Israel, promoting civil rights, balancing the budget, Truman had extraordinarily big and difficult issues on his plate, and he gets them right. The way Truman made decisions was interesting. Here's a picture of Harry in Key West. Has anybody been down to the Key West Truman home? Anybody? I'm seeing those here. Jimbo has been down there. Anybody else? Let me see if I get any. Okay, yes. Okay, good. A couple of, okay, good. Susie, I see a couple more of you doing that. Okay, good. All right, there we go. Truman did not use Camp David, which was named by Eisenhower for his grandson, David Eisenhower. It used to be known as Camp Shangri-La by FDR. Truman went to Key West, 11 visits for a total of 175 days. Then he made 5 additional visits down there while in retirement. He loved it. It was good for his decision-making because Truman said, "I needed time to think, rest, and just get out of the rat race." Down there, he could sit, read, think, relax. I interviewed all of his aides that were still alive, as I said, and I asked them, tell me how an uneducated, failed haberdasher and farmer from rural Missouri made all these momentous decisions in history. And they told me the following. 1, Truman hired the best of the best of the best. Not all presidents do. Some have embarrassing cabinets and advisors. Truman only hired the best of the best of the best, Democrats and Republicans. So he wanted himself surrounded by the best. Secondly, he would tell aides that you are free to disagree with me. You know, Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were so thin-skinned, they would fire anybody who disagreed with them. George W. Bush would only hire ideologues and sycophants. Jimmy Carter thought he knew more than everybody. Trump hired a collection of criminals and clowns who didn't know what they were doing and wouldn't listen to anyone. Even if you like him, you got to admit that's true. So these presidents, LBJ, Nixon, all the way up, they would fire everybody. Not so with Truman. Truman, the aides told me, he would demand that they disagree with him. In fact, he would say, that's an order from your commander. Truman always told his aides that debate, dissent, and disagreement are essential elements for our democracy. Third key to his decision-making, he'd sit everybody in a room, and when he had an issue, a speech, a treaty, a bill, he's going to sign, whatever the issue was, he made everybody weigh in. You all have to have skin in the game. He made everybody weigh in, and he sat poker-faced. No one knew if he was for or against it. He wanted everybody to tell him what they would do. Then he would tell everybody, okay, I'm going to think I'm going to think about it tonight, sleep on it. We'll meet at 05:30 the next morning, military hour, and you'll have my decision. That brings me to the fourth and final part of Truman's decision-making. The next morning, they would always meet bright and early before dawn. Truman would come in and he would tell them, he said, okay, I have one more question for you. And they all told me, he said the exact same thing. He would say, now tell me, is this the right thing we're doing? In the end analysis, it simply came down to right and wrong. How about that, everybody? Doesn't that sound almost quaint in our politics? Is it the right? If it was the right thing, Truman said, okay, then that's our policy. If it was the wrong thing, back to the drawing board. Dropping the bomb. Truman had to make what is arguably the most difficult decision of any human being in history, to drop the bomb. However, we need to know that military estimates were that if we invaded Japan, we would lose 250,000 men. Japan would lose 1 million. In dropping the bomb, how many men did we lose? 0. Some of Truman's aides told me that if Truman did not drop the bomb, and we had a year-long, multi-billion-dollar bloodbath, and if the country found out we could have ended it without a single loss of life, he would have been impeached. Also, Truman knew that we had cracked Japan's code. So even though it was believed that Japan did not have any planes left, we cracked the code and they had airplanes left with just enough gas to get in the air, 1 bomb, and a kamikaze suicide pilot. We would have hundreds of ships at anchor off the shore for an invasion of Japan. All of a sudden, out of the clouds come a squadron of planes. Even with your anti-aircraft guns, if you shoot them, if they're hell-bent on hitting your ship, there's nothing you can do. It would have been a bloodbath. We also knew in cracking the code that Japanese women and children were being given sharpened bamboo, hand grenades, poison. They were told to fight to the last man, woman, and child. If we invaded Japan, it would have been a city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street, house by house, room by room war. It would have been horrific, and the casualties would have been unthinkable. Plus, we would have firebombed all those cities before we hit them. So the Japanese we actually saved Japanese lives by dropping the bomb, and many, many, many other reasons. However, we remain the only country that has let the atomic beast or genie out of the bottle, I guess you could say. So it was a tough decision for Truman, but I believe the right decision that he made to save American lives. Just yesterday, I was giving a speech, and a man in his 90s came up to me and he got teary-eyed. And this happens to me, without exaggeration, everybody, 100 times in my life, because everybody knows what I do for a living and I'm always talking about this stuff. This elderly man came up to me and said what 99 of his predecessors have. He came up and he hugged me and he said, Harry Truman saved my life. He said, I was on a ship headed to Japan, and our commanding officer told us to look to our left and right and say goodbye because those guys aren't coming back. He said, our commanding officer said, get out paper and pencil and write to your girlfriend and your mom. Have those letters ready because this is going to be horrific. Remember, the Japanese fought like demons at Iwo Jima. We suffered 26,000 casualties for an insignificant volcanic piece of rock. Many Japanese committed hara-kiri with the sword or jumped off a cliff rather than let us feed them and clothe them, surrender. You know, we use flamethrowers for those hiding in the rocks and mountains. And with the Japanese interpreter, we told them what we were going to do. They accepted being burned to death rather than being fed and cared for us. This is how fanatical they were. We need to remember the Japanese were fanatical. So Truman saved lives. The Truman Doctrine. This is the post-war doctrine that guided us through the Cold War. Truman knew that any friend in need is someone we would help. The communists were looking at taking over Turkey and Greece. That, as you know, and you can see, is the bottom door to Europe. It is a geopolitically significant piece of real estate. Greece and Turkey were collapsing and were about to go communist. Truman got aid money, and Harry Truman, over a reluctant Congress, over a reluctant country, pretty much saves Greece and Turkey from joining a Soviet sphere. And this really guides our Cold War policy. Also, Truman adopts the policy of multilateralism over unilateralism. We work in concert with our allies instead of by ourselves. Truman adopts the position of internationalism over isolation and working, collectively. So Truman, pretty much a failed haberdasher, is the architect of the post-war order, everybody. Isn't that something? And I should say this, every single president after Truman, Ike, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush one, every single president after him but one followed Truman's blueprint on foreign policy and the international order to the crossing of the T and the dotting of the I. When Ronald Reagan passed, for example, I wrote an obit and spoke to several media outlets. And one of Reagan's legacies was Reagan deserves some credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union because he spent so much on defense that the Soviets couldn't keep up. And that's true, but also Truman deserved credit for the collapse of the Soviet Union because he designed the policy, even up through Biden follows. The only president that abandoned Truman's blueprint was, of course, Donald Trump, who said it's a joke and it doesn't work. Every other president, and apologies to the friends that like Trump, but it's a fact. Every other president of both parties, Bush one, Reagan, everybody, Ike, thought it was the right thing to do. So Truman designs this, the post-war order. The Marshall Plan. That's General George Marshall right there. Truman called him the Great Marshal. This is a $15 billion plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. Was this popular? Good gracious, no. We were in debt. Americans have a knee-jerk isolationism, yet we're going to rebuild Europe. And Truman does, and he gets support from Eisenhower, Marshall, and everybody. It's named the Marshall Plan because Harry Truman was so humble. Truman also knew that Truman, was not popular. Truman could not go to Congress and get them to kick out billions. Truman could not go to world leaders. He lacked the gravitas and stature and get world leaders to follow him. Who could? Marshall. So Truman, in a great act of magnanimity, if Bill Clinton came up with this plan, it would be the Bill Clinton plan. And Bill Clinton would still be saying, thank you very much, right? But Truman named it after Marshall. And Marshall did it and got it done. And we saved Europe, everybody. Truman knew, think of it this way. During the war, the farm fields remained fallow. So there was no food after the war. Sewage systems were blown up from bombing the continent. Raw sewage was festering. Think of the disease. Carcasses of humans and pigs and horses and cows are strewn across the continent. There's no medicine. But how do we get medicine, coal, heating oil, blankets, food to the people of Europe? The roads were blown up, the bridges were blown up, the airports were cratered and pockmarked, our ships were sunk. How do we do this? Truman knew that we needed to move heaven and earth. and feed and provide medicine for the people of Europe. Otherwise, there would be a pandemic and continent-wide starvation. So he actually started as soon as the war ended, and then it warped into the Marshall Plan. And Truman fed a continent, and I believe saved millions of lives. I have always argued that Harry Truman should have received the Nobel Peace Prize for saving millions of Europeans and the American people for what they did. And it came through the Marshall Plan. The Berlin airlift, that's what I just told you about a moment ago. And here on the right is Trizonia, when we had a British zone, a French zone, an American zone, and then we divided East and West Europe and so on. We ended up taking control of all of it because Britain and France were on their knees after the war. So every minute there, we had planes coming in to deliver everything the people of Berlin needed. What a remarkable policy. Oh, there's the candy bomber. I told you about him earlier. There's Gail Horvison. Just a couple years ago, I brought him to the Truman home. He was still alive in his 90s as of a few years ago. And there's his plane on the right. He would waggle the wings and the kids would come running out like it was the Pied Piper. Boy, if that doesn't say something about Harry Truman's heart. Civil rights. Harry Truman wanted a civil rights bill after World War II. But Southern Democrats and the Republicans defeated it. So, and when they defeated it, they told Truman, you thought you could get through the door, didn't you? But we got it shut. Truman said, nope, you didn't get the door shut because my foot's in it. He said, I can use an executive order. So the president is the commander in chief. Lincoln used an executive order / proclamation for the Emancipation Proclamation. Truman had a precedent. He integrated the armed forces through an executive order 9981. And when he did it brilliantly. You know, the country was pretty racist in the 40s. Truman did it by identifying great American heroes. He said those Tuskegee Airmen, how many black soldiers fought and then they come back here and are discriminated against? We need this for them. Number two, the Japanese Americans, the 442nd, the Go for Broke, if anybody knows their military history. All those Japanese Americans from Hawaii were one of the most decorated units of the war, that they came back to discrimination. Navajo code talkers, have you heard of them, anybody? The Navajo Indians who would use their code, and one radio operator to another with Navajo to Navajo, the Japanese would listen in. They had no idea what they were saying, yet they were discriminated against. Jewish veterans, they were discriminated against. So Truman integrates the military. Statehood for Israel, May 14th, 1948 at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Truman signs the proclamation recognizing Israel. He does a lot more. That's him on the left with Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the great Zionist leader, and with Ben-Gurion, David Ben-Gurion, the leader on the right. Truman floats Israel a $100 million loan guarantee because they were broke. Truman pushes for immigration from the displaced persons camps in Europe to Palestine and Transjordan so folks could relocate. Truman sets up what is basically most favored nation trading status with the new fledgling country because the world was boycotting Israel. Truman's the one who sets up the joint military training, intelligence sharing, immigration, cultural exchanges, and everything to help Israel out. He also is the one who sent aid and medicines and clothing to the displaced persons camps after the war. And Truman brought in almost 400,000 Jewish refugees after the war. Many of them did not want to go back to Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria. Who can blame them? If I'm a Jew living in 1945 and I'm from Germany, I'm not going back, or Poland, or so Truman brought about 400,000 people in. There on the bottom right, recognizing it's the American Cemetery in France, the Jewish contributions. Top right, the Tuskegee Airmen. Bottom left, the Japanese 442nd, and those top left, the Navajo code talkers. Turnip Day. One of the greatest speeches ever given is one no one knows, and that's Harry Truman at the Democratic Convention in 1948. July 26th, 1948. So here it is. The party that has the White House goes second at the convention. So the Republicans went first, Democrats go second. For 1 year, Truman pushed an expansion of the GI Bill, and the Republicans killed it. Truman pushed an expansion of health care, and the Republicans killed it. Truman pushed Social Security expansion, Republicans killed it. Civil rights, the Republicans killed it. Everything. They killed everything. Sound familiar? So what happens, the Republicans get up at their convention in the summer of 48 and says, if you vote for us, we'll give you health care, Social Security, blah, 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 the GI Bill. So Truman gets up at the convention and he says, in Missouri, we have an old saying. It goes like this: on the 26th of July, you sow your turnips wet or dry. He says, today's the 26th of July. The Republicans say if you vote for them, they just finished telling you they're going to give you health care, Social Security, blah, 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 when in fact, they spent the last year killing all that. So let's take them at their word that they tell you they want to give it to you. Tomorrow, I'm calling Congress into a special session. I'm going to call it the Turnip Day session. And I want them to put bills on my desk, and you have my word, I'll sign it. Guess how many bills they put on his desk? None. Let me bring this to an end. The whistle stop, Truman's famous whistle stop when he gets elected. I'll end here. You all heard of the whistle stop, everybody? So he takes the train to Ferdinand Magellan, crosses the heartland to beat Mr. Dewey in 1948. Dewey gets lazy and pretty much stops campaigning because all the polls show Dewey's going to win in a walk. There's Truman holding up the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman. They went to press in Chicago before the results were tabulated. Everybody, Truman's aides knew he was going to lose. Everybody but Truman. One of Truman's senior advisors I interviewed, he told me that on that train, his name was George. He said, George, take out a piece of paper and a pen. Write this down. Truman went state by state across the country and told him how each state's going to vote in the breakdown. And Elsie kept that. That paper's now in the Truman Presidential Library. I've seen it. I interviewed Elsie, and Truman predicted the correct outcome of the election. He's the only one. Truman got a couple of speechwriters. One's name was Ken. The other one was Milton. I interviewed both of them. Ken became my mentor. He was the last Truman aide to pass at 102 or 3 a few years ago. So Truman sent the aides to all these little towns around the country. Truman took his train to every backwater town of 200 people without a traffic light, okay? And nobody met the president in towns like that. Nobody had ever had any visitors. So here comes Truman. He sent the aides to the town ahead of him. Guess what he asked the aides to do? Find out what is the crop they grow and how it's doing. Secondly, how's the high school football team's record this fall, because it's the election in the fall. Thirdly, every little town has a statue of a war hero downtown. Who's on the statue and what's the story? Truman has a photographic memory. So what he does is they tell him all this. He pulls into the town and he says to the town, I heard that your corn isn't doing very well. You're only getting, $4 a bushel. It must have been that horrible rainstorm back in July 30th or whatever. And the farmers in the town are thinking, how does he know this? And then he reminds them he was a farmer and he talks to people in language they understand. Then he says, if you elect me, I'm going to give him hell the way your high school football team did last weekend when they won 14-7 against Jefferson High. People are thinking, who is this guy? And then he would tell them, and I want you to know that I was a veteran. I will always respect soldiers and POWs and the fallen the same way you respected. And he would tell them about the guy on the statue downtown. And then he'd wave, they'd toot the horn, and the train would go down the tracks. And there he is on the lower left waving goodbye to everybody. So how do you not vote for that guy, right, everyone? And that's a little bit about Harry Truman, a really, really common man who was an uncommon leader, who was utterly unaffected by power and success to the day of his death, who a number of aides and secretaries told me that Truman would always tell them that you can call me Harry. Could you imagine the president saying, hey, Jeanette, just call me Robert, wow, right? And I'll leave you with this. Ken Heckler, who was my mentor, every year, several times a year, we got together and I taped his oral history for the library, and he told me all sorts of great stories. He worked for FDR. He met Eleanor, he met Martin Luther King. I mean, he was a great, great, great mentor and a great friend. Ken told me that one day at a meeting, he said Ken had a tragedy in his life. He was depressed. And in the middle of the meeting, Truman looks over and stops his meeting and says, Ken, are you okay? Something's wrong. And Ken said, Mr. President, I'm fine. As you were, you're the president. We're dealing with NATO or something, right? It's fine. And Truman said, nah, something's wrong. You want to tell me? You want to talk? Ken said, no, Mr. President, I'm good. Proceed. Ken told me that after the meeting, one of Truman's aides walked up and handed him a letter. Truman invited Ken to join him for dinner that night. Ken said, I sat down alone in the White House with the president, and he talked to me and made sure I was okay. To cheer me up after dinner, he put on a piano concert for me. And then when he said goodbye to Ken, he told Ken his favorite joke, which was what all the aides told me. Truman said, he said, politics is such a nasty business. He said, so here's how nasty it is. He says, don't tell my mother that I'm in politics because she thinks I play the piano in a whorehouse. And he laughed and laughed and said goodbye. Ken said, I left the White House happy and cheered up. So thanks everybody for your attention. And I'm happy to take.
Yeah, that was amazing. So there's a question. Eileen has a question. How supportive was Bess through Harry's presidency?
She wasn't. I've never been a fan of Bess. During some of the most critical hours of Truman's presidency, Bess leaves and goes home. She's kind of a Melania figure like that. She wants nothing to do with it. Even Mamie Eisenhower, who was not an active first lady, was there for Ike. Bess, not so much. One of the aides told me that one day Harry was sitting around eating lunch with all of them, and the aide said that Truman was so depressed, everybody was abandoning his campaign. Bess was upset at him because she didn't agree with him. Congress was against him. Truman had the very first public opinion approval poll on the presidency was taken in the year 1933 by George Gallup. The president with the all-time lowest approval was not Trump, not Carter, not Nixon, not W after Hurricane Katrina. It was Truman, all-time lowest, 22%. The aide said Truman was so depressed, he's sitting there, Bess left, and with his spoon and fork, he's pushing the peas around the plate. And he's putting them in like a little pile, like a kid. And then he mumbles to himself like 36. He counted the peas. He was just sitting there all depressed because everybody hated him and the press made fun of him and Congress opposed everything. The Republicans couldn't stand him. But today we all love Harry and we appreciate all that he did. So yeah, Bess wasn't real supportive.
There you go. Rose, go ahead. I'm going to unmute you if you want to unmute.
There.
Go ahead.
That's what I was going to ask. Is that a true copy of the Tribune?
This is one of the originals. That's why it's in glass. And I mean, it's under plastic and in my office. Yeah.
Also, with his eidetic mind,
what's that?
with his eidetic mind, when he was in these round rooms of people that they were discussing things before he would figure out whether it was yay or nay, did he really remember everything that most of those people said?
Truman was photographic. He had a photographic
That's eidetic.
No question. As I told you with the eye exam and Wanda's son's birthday, another aide told me that Truman went to the press dinner with the press, where they roast one another and make fun. And one of the reporters was making fun of Truman for being a bumpkin, country boy. And Truman turned around and recites like Chaucer. He cites classic medieval literature, page after page off the top of his head, and then kind of winked at him like, not so bad, right? When Truman met Abba Eban, who was Israel's ambassador, Abba Eban said Truman knew more about Jewish history than Abba Eban did, who was classic, Oxford, kind of a guy. He said Truman ticked off a couple 1,000-year history of the Hebrew people. He knew names, dates, details, everything. So Truman was photographic. Yeah, he always remembered stuff his aide said. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. And John, go ahead.
I know this question is more about Roosevelt than Truman, but in your research, do you have anything that could offer an understanding to us more of why he isolated him from the end of war decisions and decision making?
Yeah, Roosevelt didn't like Truman. He didn't dislike him. He really didn't know him. Um, FDR thought he would just be loyal. He would be a reliable arm twister in the Senate. Remember, one thing a president needs, your vice president is in charge of corralling votes in the Senate. At least they used to be. And Henry Wallace just would not do that for FDR. So FDR was angry at Henry Wallace. So FDR also was FDR was a great president, but he was a megalomaniac. He literally thought he was going to live through the fourth term. He started vacationing at Warm Springs, Georgia, where he passed on April 12th. He thought that he didn't need to bring Truman into his confidence. He was remember, this is his 12th year as president when he died. He was just reelected for his fourth term. The 22nd Amendment limiting a president to 2 terms didn't come into effect until 1953. So FDR just never bothered to bring Harry in. Remember, FDR had an impressive array of senior advisors and an impressive cabinet. He relied on them, not on his vice president. Now, had FDR lived and served his full 4-year term, I still don't think he would have brought Truman into his confidence, but he would have prepped him a little bit. You need to remember, sir, that John Adams, for example, he didn't even go to the Capitol when George Washington was governing from New York and Philadelphia. John Adams was Washington's vice president. Early vice presidents didn't even show up. In 1923, when Warren G. Harding died in San Francisco of a heart attack, he fell face first into a bowl of crabs floating in butter in San Francisco. They could not find his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. They couldn't find him. My joke was always, it's a shame they ever did. So they found Coolidge in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, where his family lived. Population 11? I don't know. It's that small. There was no major road, airport, rail, waterway in and out of Plymouth Notch. So they quickly got his dad, who was the justice of the peace. And in his living room, he was sworn in by his dad on the Bible. That's because they couldn't find Coolidge. I was just at his homestead 2 weeks ago. If you're all in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, Calvin Coolidge is not very exciting, but we have a lovely historical park there in Homestead with the butter churn, old-fashioned cheese making. I was actually the chair of the commission that helped to set all that up, even though I never liked Coolidge. I got some good cheese and Vermont maple syrup out of it. So we got to remember the presidents just didn't take their vice president into much consideration. Truman would be the first president to really reach out to Alvin Barkley as vice president. And then you really don't see vice presidents being assigned much of a role until Carter picks Mondale, because Carter lacked foreign policy experience or any international experience. Mondale had both legislative and foreign policy experience. So Mondale's given a portfolio by Carter. Ever since then, with the exception of Dan Quayle, vice presidents have participated in governance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I see that Ira or Bonnie typed in any anecdotes this time about infamous card games in Key West. I guess there are times you've spoken about that, or
Ira and Bonnie, they're friends. Good to hear from you. I'm glad you're on the call. Yeah, here's a good one. So I told you Truman spent 175 days on 11 official visits to Key West during his presidency. And he made important decisions while there. He had world leaders, generals, Supreme Court justices. In fact, his decision to not run for a third term was made in Key West because he was grandfathered in on the 22nd Amendment. He could have had a third term if he wanted. At any rate, so here's a good one about the card games. And I actually got to play a role in this. So several years ago, the director of that Truman home, his name was Bob Walls, W-O-L-Z. I served on a board with him. He called me on the phone, freaked out. He said, guess what I just found? They found boxes of letters, heretofore unknown, boxes of letters in the attic of the little White House in Key West. One hurricane, and those things could have been gone from history. Here's why the letters were a veritable treasure trove. The little White House in Key West, it was the admiral's home at the Key West Naval Station. So the admiral assigned a young naval lieutenant to follow Truman around 24/7. He literally sat outside his door when he slept. If there's anything Truman wants, get it for him. Orange juice in the morning, and write down every hour what Truman was doing. So this is a treasure trove, everybody, that Bob found. So I immediately rush down to Key West. I take my graduate students and we start typing furiously to transcribe all that and digitize it. Subsequently, all that rich resource has gone to the Truman Library and the National Archives. So now it's saved and it's available to the public. Anyway, so about 20 some years ago, I bring together all the living advisors to Truman. I take them all down to the little White House and we're all hanging out, drinking Truman's old granddad bourbon, playing cards at Truman's card table. It was magical, everybody. I'm there with all these 90-year-old guys that work for Harry, having a great time. They let me even stay in Truman's home. They let me, I was just there again a couple of weeks ago. They always let me stay in Truman's home, which is really, really cool. Consequently, I do a ton of free stuff for them. I was raising a lot of money to help redo the carpet and wallpaper at Truman's home. The problem was we only had black and white photos. So we knew what it looked like. We didn't know the color. So I brought all these aides who spent all that time in Truman's house and asked them to remember what the color was. So when we recreate the wallpaper and the carpet, we could get the right color. And they did remember it. So we're sitting around playing cards, Ira, and here's what I said. So I told the aides, I said, I have something exciting to tell you. And I told them that Bob just found these boxes of reports on it's what Truman did every hour of the day. And the aides are going, oh my God, that's amazing. And one of the senior aides said, what'd you learn? Because I told him I went through everything to help digitize it and preserve it. I said, well, what we learned is Truman worked his butt off when he was in Key West, not vacationing. And the aides all said, no, he didn't work hard when he was down here. In Washington, he worked like a demon, but not down here. He enjoyed the Keys. I said, no, you're wrong. He worked really hard. I said, for example, every day, the young lieutenant in the Navy would write down at 8 in the morning, Truman would say, okay, boys, it's time to get some work done. At midnight on the weekend, Truman's saying, boys, we got to get some more work done. At all hours of the day, boys, time to get more work done. And I said, you see, he worked hard. And one of the senior aides starts laughing. Then they all start laughing. They said, no. Here's what happened. That aide was supposed to write everything down. And the first day down there in the morning, Truman wakes up and says, okay, boys, it's time to drink some old granddad and cheat at poker. And the aide says, Mr. President, I can't write down that you're cheating at poker and drinking bourbon at 8 in the morning. And Truman says, write it down. I don't care. The aide says, I can't. Truman says, then don't write anything. The aide says, the admiral told me to write everything down. Truman says, I don't care if I'm drinking bourbon. Write down I'm drinking bourbon. So the aide said, Mr. President, Truman said, for goodness sakes, then just write whatever you want. So whenever Truman said that, the aide wrote, all right, boys, time to get some work done. So we all got a good laugh out of it. So Ira, there's your card story. So Truman spent more time playing cards in Key West and going to the beach than he did working.
Thank you.
So there was a question came in from Diana. Why didn't Truman run again in 1952?
All right, so Truman legally could have run again. As I said, the 22nd Amendment didn't take an effect until January 20th, 1953, when Truman left office. Truman didn't run again for two reasons. Number one, Bess had it with Washington. Bess was done with all that. Number two, Truman didn't know if he could win. Here was Truman's concern, General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was a peacock who thought he knew more than he did, who wouldn't listen to anyone. MacArthur was a narcissist and a megalomaniac. Truman always said MacArthur's one of the most dangerous people in the country. MacArthur wanted to be the president, and Truman said nobody will beat him. Plus, what else was happening in the Republican Party at the time? Joe McCarthy and Richard Nixon. The Republican Party went nuts with the communist Red Scare, locking people up. Truman said, my God, you could have McCarthy, Nixon backing General MacArthur, and we're in trouble. Truman knew that Eisenhower could win. And Truman and Ike had a weird relationship. They were on again, off again, on again, off again. Some weeks they got along, some weeks they fought. They were like the old married couple that couldn't live with one another, couldn't live without one another. And I know none of you know what that is like. So, but Harry respected Ike even when they didn't get along. And he knew Ike was a good man and Ike would be a good president. Ike was a very good Supreme Allied commander. So Truman thought, if Truman said, if I run, I'm liable to put MacArthur along with McCarthy and Nixon in power. So Truman got out of the way, and sure enough, Ike won and did a decent job.